ever find yourself in that situation? You know, like you're at a whiskey tasting and everyone's throwing around words like panic this or peat that.
Oh, yeah.
And you're just kind of nodding along like you know what's going on.
Right.
But secretly you're hoping they don't ask you to describe
It
anything.
happens. It's like there's this whole secret language.
Totally.
And if you don't know the code, you're kind of missing out on half the fun.
It's so true. And today we are handing you the code book. We're doing a deep dive into 10 whiskey tasting terms, the kind that'll have you swirling and sniffing with the best of them. But, and here's the key, we don't want you just memorizing definitions.
Right.
We're going deeper.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, imagine if instead of just knowing the word for mountain in another language,
Yeah.
you understood like how the mountains in that place were formed, the folklore around them.
I love that.
That's what we're doing here, turning tasting notes from just words into stories.
I'm already hooked. Okay, so our sources lay out 10 terms for us. Peaty, malty, spicy, fruity, oaky, floral, rich, smoky, tannic, and nutty. Some are pretty self-explanatory, others not so much. Let's picture this. We've got a flight of whiskeys lined up, each one highlighting one of these terms. Let's start with peaty. That one conjures up a very specific image for me. How about you?
Oh, absolutely. Peaty is almost synonymous with Islay Scotch whiskey. Like you say, P, I'm thinking Lagavulin, Ardbeg, that intense smokiness, almost medicinal. And that comes directly from using peat to dry the malted barley in the whiskey making process.
Okay, so we're talking actual peat bogs, that decomposed plant matter being burned, and the smoke from that is what infuses the barley.
You got it. And here's where it gets even cooler. The type of peat makes a difference too. Islay peat, that's where you get those really strong, medicinal, almost iodine-like notes. But peat from Orkney, for instance, might be earthier, more like damp moss.
Wow, so there's a whole world of peat out there. Our sources also mention that peatiness can mellow with age. Is that always the case?
Not always. Think of it like this. A young, peaty whiskey, it's like a bonfire on the beach, intense, immediate. Aging can be like moving that fire into a stone fireplace. You're still going to get that smokiness, but some of that initial harshness gets tamed, integrated. Maybe you even start to get hints of the wood alongside it.
So it's less about the age softening it, more about adding layers to the story.
Exactly. It becomes more complex, more nuanced.
Fascinating. Okay, from the smoky depths, let's lighten things up a bit. Malty. This one feels like the heart of whiskey itself, don't you think?
Totally. If peaty is the land, malty is that soul of the grain. It's that foundational sweetness, like a freshly baked bread, maybe a hint of honey or biscuit, depending on the whiskey.
Our sources point out that Speyside and Highland single malts often have those classic malty notes. What makes those regions so good at showcasing that particular flavor?
It's a few things, actually. The water in those regions is often described as soft, which is ideal for whiskey making. Then you have the long fermentation times that a lot of distillers in those areas prefer, and that really lets those bready, malty flavors develop.
So it's not just the barley itself, but how it's treated throughout the process.
You got it. Just like the same ingredients can make, like a simple cookie or an elaborate pastry, you know?
Totally.
And those regional differences, even down to the specific types of yeast strains used, those add nuances to those core malty flavors. It's subtle, but once you start recognizing it, it changes how you experience the whiskey.
I'm already paying more attention to those subtle differences. Okay, from the comforting to the bold, let's talk spicy. Now, we're not talking chili pepper hot here, are we?
Not quite, though some whiskeys do have a surprising kick, I'll give you that. But when we're talking spicy in whiskey, think more along the lines of warming spices, cinnamon, maybe cloves, a hint of black pepper, that kind of thing.
Got it, got it. And our notes mention rye whiskeys often having that spicy character. Is that because of the rye grain itself, or is it something else?
It's a little both, actually. Rye naturally has a bit of a spicy, peppery quality to it that you don't get as much with, say, corn or barley. But how it's aged, specifically the type of oak cask it's aged in, can really amplify that spiciness.
So the cask is like the spice rack, bringing out different dimensions of the flavor already present.
Precisely. Like a rye aged in American oak, you might get those vanilla and caramel notes we talked about before, but alongside the spice. But take that same rye and put it in a cask that previously held, say, a spicy French red wine, suddenly you've got a whole new dimension of spice, maybe even some dried fruit notes coming into play.
Whoa, okay. I'm starting to see how these terms are really just the starting point. It's like this whole web of influences behind each one.
Oh, absolutely.
What about fruity? That's got to be a crowd pleaser.
It is, and there's a ton of variety within fruity whiskey, too. You can get bright citrus, juicy berries, dried fruits like raisin or fig. It all comes down to how those flavors develop during the whiskey's, well, life.
So we're not talking about distillers just like tossing a handful of berries into the barrel here,
Yeah.
right?
Heck, I wish it were that simple.
Yeah.
No, remember those casks we were just talking about? A big part of that fruity character comes from there. If a whiskey's aged in a cask that used to hold, say, port wine, it can take on those rich, plummy, almost jammy characteristics.
It's like the cask infuses it with the ghost of fruits past.
In a way.
Our sources mention Speyside and lowland whiskeys being known for being on the fruity side. What is it about those regions? Do they use special casks or?
It's a bunch of factors working together, honestly. The climate plays a role, the type of stills they traditionally use in those regions, even down to the yeast strains that are common there. It can all enhance those fruity characteristics. Like Speyside distillers, they often use longer fermentation times, which allows those fruity esters, the compounds that actually create those aromas, to really flourish.
So it's like the region's personality gets baked right into the whiskey.
I like that. Yeah, there's a real sense of place that comes through.
That's amazing. I'm realizing now why just saying a whiskey is good doesn't really cut it. There's so much more going on.
Right.
Okay, speaking of which, let's dive into oaky. This one seems pretty straightforward. It's all about the influence of the barrel, right?
It is, but it's actually way more nuanced than people think. You know how sometimes oaky gets a bad rap? Like
Yeah.
it's overpowering the other flavors?
Totally. Like, I'm not trying to gnaw on a barrel stave here.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Oak isn't just wood flavor. It's vanilla, caramel, spice. Even those drying tannins we'll talk about later come from the oak.
Okay, that's interesting. So how do you tell good oaky from the kind that just overpowers everything? Our sources mention the type of oak and how long it's aged making a difference.
It's all about balance. Finding that sweet spot where the oak complements the other flavors without taking over. Think about those classic American bourbons. A lot of them are aged in charred American white oak. So you get those lovely vanilla and caramel notes, a hint of smokiness from the char, but it doesn't obliterate the other flavors.
So it's like the oak is a supporting character, not the star of the show.
Exactly. Now compare that to a whiskey finished in, say, a sherry cask. European oak, which sherry casks are often made from, has those denser wood tannins, so you might get dried fruit notes, nutty notes, even a bit of leather or tobacco.
Wow, okay, that is way more complex than just tastes like wood. How am I supposed to pick up on all of that?
It takes practice, for sure. One tip, pay close attention to the finish of the whiskey. Those oaky flavors tend to linger, so after you swallow, see what's left on your palate. Is it pleasant, warming, complex, or is it just kind of dry and astringent, making you want to reach for a glass of water?
Okay, so lingering good, thirsty bad. Got it. All right, from oak forest to something a little more, shall we say, fragrant? Let's talk floral. I'm picturing a field of wildflowers. What about you?
You're not far off. Floral in whiskey is all about subtlety. We're not talking about a big perfumed bouquet, but rather those delicate hints of rose, lavender, maybe even a chamomile tea kind of thing.
Elegant. Our sources say this is something you often find in lowland whiskeys. Is that because of the actual flowers growing in those regions, or is there something else at play?
Well, Scotland's not exactly known for its, balmy climate, so it's probably not the flowers themselves. It has more to do with the actual style of whiskey they tend to make in the lowlands. They often use these taller stills, which result in a lighter, more delicate spirit overall, and that allows those floral notes to really shine through.
So the equipment they use influences the flavor profile as well. That's fascinating. It's like the difference between cooking something over a campfire versus using a high-tech stovetop,
I like that analogy. Yeah, it's about precision and how even small changes in the process can lead to big differences in flavor.
Okay, from delicate florals to something a little more, shall we say decadent? Let's talk rich. I'm ready for a luxurious whiskey experience.
Then rich is definitely the word you're looking for. We're talking about whiskeys with a really full-bodied, almost decadent flavor profile. They coat your palate, those flavors linger, they really invite you to savor every sip.
Sounds delightful. Our sources call out sherried whiskeys like Macallan as prime examples of rich. Is it the sherry itself doing that, or is there more to it?
Sherry casks definitely play a huge role. They impart those dried fruit notes, rich caramel, sometimes even hints of chocolate or nuttiness, depending on the specific sherry used. But age is a factor too, can't forget about that.
Huh.
The longer a whiskey spends in the cask, the more time it has to interact with the wood, drawing out those richer, more concentrated flavors.
So a young whiskey might be fruity, but its older sibling is rich. and complex.
Exactly. It's like the difference between like biting into a fresh strawberry versus savoring a spoonful of aged balsamic vinegar. Both delicious, but entirely different experiences.
Okay, I am getting hungry now. But before we break out the cheese board, let's talk smoky. Now, we already covered peaty, so how is smoky any different?
Great question. Remember how peaty comes specifically from drying the barley over peat fires? Well, smoky in whiskey can also come from the cask itself.
Wait, seriously, they like set the barrels on fire?
Not quite. Well, not always, at least. A lot of whiskey barrels are charred on the inside before the whiskey goes in. This charring imparts a smoky flavor that's distinct from peat smoke, though. It's more campfirey, think toasted marshmallows, maybe a hint of coffee, depending on how much char there is.
Okay, that makes sense. So you could have a whiskey that's both peaty and smoky from the barrel,
Yeah.
adding even more layers of flavor.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And those layers can interact in some really interesting ways. Maybe the peat smoke is more on the medicinal side, and the cask char brings a bit of sweetness that balances it out. Or you could have a bourbon that's not peaty at all, but those charred oak notes give it this whole other dimension of smoky depth.
This is blowing my mind. I had no idea there was so much nuance to something as seemingly simple as smoky.
It's a whole world of flavor.
It really is. Okay, what about tannic? That one always sounds a little intense to me.
It can be.
Oh.
Think about the last time you had a really strong black tea and you felt that drying sensation on your tongue. Those are tannins at work. They come from the wood, and they give a whiskey structure and that drying astringency. Wines have them too, especially red wines. Now, too much tannin can be harsh, but in balance, it adds complexity.
So it's like a really tannic whiskey would be like drinking that oversteeped tea you were talking about. Not ideal.
Exactly. You want those tannins to be integrated, adding grip and structure without being overwhelming. A well-aged whiskey, especially one that's spent a decent amount of time in, say, European oak casks, will often have those really well-developed tannins.
It's like the tannins age gracefully alongside the whiskey itself, becoming smoother and more refined over time.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, last but certainly not least on our list, nutty. This one seems pretty self-explanatory, but I have a feeling there's more to it than meets the eye.
There always is. Nutty can be everything from these delicate almond hints to a rich hazelnut or even pecan flavors. And those flavors, they can come from both the grain itself and those trusty casks we keep coming back to.
So just to be clear, they're not just tossing a handful of almonds into the barrel, are they?
Though some experimental distillers might, you never know. But in all seriousness, those nutty flavors, they often develop during the aging process itself.
How so? Are there certain types of oak that lend themselves to those nutty flavors?
Absolutely. Remember those sherry casks we talked about earlier? Well, they're a big one. They can impart those nutty oxidative flavors to the whiskey. Think about what happens when you leave a cut apple out on the counter. It starts to brown, right?
Right.
That's oxidation. And it can create those nutty, savory, dried, fruity flavors in whiskey too.
So it's like controlled aging, but in a barrel instead of on my countertop.
Exactly. And those nutty flavors, they can really add a ton of complexity and depth to a whiskey. Think about how well nuts pair with so many other flavors, right? Chocolate, fruit, even cheese. It's the same with whiskey. Those nutty notes can bring everything together in a really satisfying way.
This has been amazing. I feel like I'm not just tasting whiskey anymore. I'm tasting the whole story behind it.
That's what we're going for. And you know what? We're only halfway through this deep dive. When we come back, we're going to talk about how to put all this knowledge into practice, how to really use these terms to enhance your whiskey experience.
Can't wait. All right, whiskey fans, welcome back to our exploration of whiskey tasting terms. When we left off, we were neck deep in the oak, talking about what makes a whiskey oaky.
And not just oaky in that like, oh, this tastes like wood kind of way.
Exactly. It's those layers of vanilla, caramel, even the tannins we'll get to later.
Right.
Yeah.
It's about appreciating those nuances. So where do we even begin with oaky? I feel like this is where things can go really right or really wrong in a whiskey.
It totally is, because too much oak, and it's like, all right, I get it, there were barrels involved, but if it's done well, magic.
Totally. It's like the oak is this secret ingredient that's been quietly working its magic behind the scenes, adding depth and complexity to the final product.
Speaking of which, our sources talk about how the type of oak, how long it's aged, even how the barrel has been treated all play a part.
Huge part. I mean, think about it. American oak versus European oak. Those are two completely different beasts when it comes to flavor.
So true. I remember reading that American oak tends to give you more of those like vanilla, coconut, maybe even a hint of dill.
Got it.
Yeah.
It's often described as being more like forward in its flavors,
Okay, yeah, I get that.
Whereas European oak, think more along the lines of dried fruits, nuts, spices, that kind of thing. It's more subtle, more restrained in a way, but still adds a ton of complexity.
So, like, American oak is the life of the party, and European oak is the sophisticated friend who tells really good stories in the corner.
I love that. Yeah, it's a good analogy.
And then you've got things like charring, which we touched on before, which adds a whole other layer of smokiness to the mix.
Don't even get me started on charring. That's a whole deep dive on its own.
Maybe it'll be our next episode.
I'm in. But yeah, all of those factors, the type of oak, the aging time, whether the cask has been charred, even things like the humidity in the warehouse where the whiskey's aging,
Yeah.
they all come together to create that final oaky character.
So, for someone like me who's maybe just starting to wrap their head around all of this, what's the key to picking up on those oaky nuances? Is it just a matter of like tasting a bunch of different whiskeys?
Tasting definitely helps. But one trick I like to use, pay close attention to the finish of the whiskey, after you swallow.
Okay,
See
yeah.
what lingers on your palate. Do you get those lingering vanilla or caramel notes, maybe a hint of spice or toasted wood, or does it just feel dry and astringent like you need a glass of water?
Oh, interesting. So lingering good, thirsty bad.
Pretty much. It's a good rule of thumb, at least.
Love it. Okay, enough about oak for now. Let's move on to something a bit lighter, a bit more, well, shall we say elegant? Floral. What comes to mind when you hear that in relation to whiskey?
I think floral bouquets, springtime. It's funny because whiskey isn't exactly known for being like delicate and flowery.
Totally.
But when you find a whiskey that has those floral notes, it's something special. It's like finding a wildflower growing in the middle of like a concrete jungle. It shouldn't be there, but it is, and it's beautiful.
I love that. It's so unexpected. Our sources mention that floral notes are often found in lowland whiskeys. Is that because of like the actual flowers growing in that region, or is it something else entirely?
It's more about the style of whiskey they tend to make in the lowlands. See, they often use these taller stills, which results in a lighter, more delicate spirit overall. And because those spirits are lighter, those subtle floral notes aren't as easily masked by, say, those big, bold, peaty or spicy flavors we were talking about earlier.
So it's like the lowland whiskeys are giving those floral notes the stage to shine.
Exactly. It's all about balance.
Makes sense. And speaking of balance, how do you find that balance between floral and, well, too floral? Like, I don't want my whiskey tasting like perfume.
Right, right. And you generally won't find that in a good whiskey. It's all about those subtle hints. Maybe it's a whiff of rose on the nose or a touch of lavender on the finish. It shouldn't be overpowering, more like a whisper of something floral in the background.
Okay, so we're talking whispers of flowers, not like shouting from the rooftops.
Exactly.
Got it. I'm ready to start using this on my friends.
Oh, this whiskey. Yes, I'm getting definite whispers of lavender on the finish.
You'll sound like a pro in no time. But seriously, paying attention to those subtle details, that's what separates the casual whiskey drinker from the true enthusiast.
It's all about the details.
Totally.
Okay, from the subtle to the, well, not so subtle, shall we say. Let's talk rich. This one feels pretty self-explanatory, but I have a feeling there's more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, rich can refer to so many different aspects of a whiskey. It could be the mouthfeel, like how it coats your tongue. It could be the intensity of the flavors, the way they linger on your palate.
Right, it's not just about one specific flavor. It's about the overall experience. Exactly. It's like, have you ever had a meal where every bite was so flavorful, so satisfying, that you just had to slow down and really savor it? That's what a rich whiskey is like.
I'm getting hungry just thinking about it. Our sources mention sherried whiskeys, like Macallan, as being good examples of rich whiskeys. Is it the sherry itself that gives them that quality, or is there something else at play?
It's definitely a combination of things. Sherry casks themselves, they're known for imparting those rich, decadent flavors to whiskey, like dried fruits, caramel, sometimes even hints of chocolate or coffee, depending on the type of sherry that was aged in the cask previously.
That's like dessert in a glass.
Kind of.
Hmm?
But then you also have to factor in things like the age of the whiskey, the type of oak used to make the cask, even the climate where the whiskey was aged. All of those things contribute to that final richness.
So it's not just about one single element, it's about all of these different elements coming together in perfect harmony to create something truly special. Kind of like a good symphony orchestra.
Exactly. And just like with a symphony, it takes a skilled conductor, or in this case, a master distiller, to bring all those elements together in a way that's balanced and harmonious.
I like that analogy. It makes me appreciate the craftsmanship that goes into making a truly great whiskey even more.
Me too. It's
Yeah.
not just about, mixing some ingredients together. It's an art form.
Totally. Okay, from rich, Let's move on to a term that's near and dear to my heart. Smoky. Now, we already talked about peaty, which definitely falls under the smoky umbrella, but how would you distinguish the two?
Ah, yes, the great peaty versus smoky debate. It's something that even seasoned whiskey drinkers sometimes get tripped up on.
Oh.
So, as we talked about before, peaty refers specifically to that smoky flavor that comes from drying the malted barley over peat fires, right?
Right.
Smoky, on the other hand, can come from a variety of sources. Yes, peat is one of them, but it can also come from things like the charring of the oak casks, which we talked about earlier.
Right, right. So a whiskey that's aged in a heavily charred cask might have those smoky notes, even if it's not peaty at all.
Exactly. And then you also have to factor in the type of smoke. Like we were saying, peat smoke can have those medicinal, almost iodine-like qualities depending on where the peat was harvested. But smoke from charred oak is going to be different. It might be more reminiscent of like a campfire, smoked meats, or even tobacco, depending on the type of oak used and how it was charred.
So when I'm tasting a whiskey, how do I tell if those smoky notes are coming from the peat or the cask or maybe even a combination of both?
It's tricky. And honestly, sometimes even the experts can't say for sure without knowing the specifics of how the whiskey was made. But there are some clues you can look for. Like if those smoky notes are really intense, almost overpowering, and they have that kind of medicinal antiseptic quality to them, chances are they're coming from peat. If they're more subtle, maybe a bit sweeter, and they remind you of things like campfire smoke or toasted marshmallows, then the cask char is probably the culprit.
Okay, so pay attention to the type of smoke as well as the intensity. Got it.
Exactly. It's all about those subtle clues.
I'm feeling like a whiskey detective over here.
That's the spirit.
All right, from smoke signals to something a little more, shall we say, grounding. Let's talk tannic.
Ah, tannic. The word that strikes fear into the hearts of some whiskey drinkers, while others can't get enough of it.
So true. I feel like tannic is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but not everyone really understands what it means.
Totally. It's not a flavor per se like sweet or spicy. It's more of a sensation, a mouthfeel.
Right. It's that drying, astringent feeling you get on your tongue.
Exactly. Think about what happens when you drink a really strong black tea or a red wine that's high in tannins. You get that puckering, almost sandpapery feeling in your mouth.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like all the moisture gets sucked right out of your mouth.
Precisely. And that's exactly what tannins do. They come from the wood, the oak casks
Yeah.
that the whiskey is aged in. And they're what give a whiskey its structure, its backbone.
Yeah.
Now, too much tannin, and it can be harsh, astringent, even bitter. But when those tannins are well integrated, they add this wonderful layer of complexity and depth to the whiskey.
So it's like tannins are the scaffolding that holds the whole flavor profile together.
Exactly. They provide structure, balance, and a certain dryness that can be really pleasing when done right. Think of it like the bass line in a song. You might not always notice it consciously, but it's there, providing the foundation for all the other instruments.
I love that analogy. So when we're tasting for tannins, what should we be looking for?
Again, pay attention to that mouthfeel. Do you feel that drying sensation on your tongue? Does it linger after you swallow? Is it pleasant or is it harsh and astringent? And here's a little tip. If you're finding the tannins to be a bit too much, try adding a drop or two of water to your whiskey. It can help to soften those tannins and make them more approachable.
Ooh, good to know. I'm always afraid to add water to my whiskey because I feel like I'm like diluting the flavor or something.
I know what you mean, but a little bit of water can actually open up the flavors and aromas, making them more pronounced. It's like, adding a little bit of water to a watercolor paint. It helps the colors to flow more freely and blend together more seamlessly.
Interesting. I'm definitely going to have to experiment with that next time I'm tasting whiskey. Okay, from the astringent to the, well, shall we say, more approachable, let's wrap up our flavor journey with nutty.
Nutty. This one always makes me think of those cozy autumn days, with the smell of roasted nuts in the air.
Me too. It's such a comforting, familiar flavor, and it seems like it could come from so many different places in the whiskey making process.
It totally can. I mean, sometimes those nutty flavors are already present in the grain itself, especially if it's been toasted or roasted before being mashed and fermented.
Right. And then there's the influence of the casks, which we've talked about ad nauseum at this point, but for good reason.
Huh. Yes, the casks. Always the casks. But it's true, they play a huge role in developing those nutty notes as well. Like, if a whiskey has been aged in a sherry cask, it often takes on these lovely almond and hazelnut flavors, sometimes even a hint of walnut or pecan.
It's like the casks are whispering nutty secrets to the whiskey while it ages.
I love that. Whispering nutty secrets. I'm going to start using that. But yeah, it's true. Those flavors develop over time as the whiskey interacts with the wood. I mean, they can range from subtle hints of almond to really rich, intense flavors of hazelnut or even peanut brittle.
Okay, now I'm really hungry.
Ah, sorry.
But in all seriousness, this has been fascinating. I feel like I've learned so much about not just what these tasting terms mean, but how to actually use them to better understand and appreciate whiskey.
That's what we were hoping for,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, it's not about memorizing a bunch of fancy words. It's about enhancing your enjoyment of this amazing spirit.
Totally. So, with that in mind, when we come back for the final part of our deep dive, let's talk about how to actually put all of this newfound knowledge into practice. How can our listeners start using these terms to elevate their own whiskey tasting experiences?
I'm excited to dig into that because, trust me, once you start paying attention to these nuances, it changes everything.
All right, whiskey enthusiasts, welcome back to the show where we've been on this incredible journey through the world of whiskey tasting
That
terms.
covered a lot of ground.
We really have. From peaty to nutty, we've broken down these terms, explored their nuances, and hopefully given you a whole new appreciation for just how much goes into creating those complex flavors we love.
It's like learning a secret language, isn't it?
It totally is. But here's the thing. Learning a language is one thing. Actually speaking it, that's where the real magic happens.
Absolutely. You can memorize all the vocabulary words you want, but if you never actually use them in conversation, what's the point?
Exactly. So for our final deep dive today, let's talk about how to actually put all of this newfound whiskey wisdom into practice.
Yes. Let's turn our listeners into fluent whiskey speakers.
I love that. Okay, so imagine this. You're at a bar or maybe browsing the whiskey aisle at your local shop.
Dangerous territory, I know.
Lumos dangerous. And you're faced with a wall of bottles, each with its own story to tell. How do you choose? How do you even begin to navigate all those options?
This is where knowing those tasting terms comes in handy.
Right, because instead of just grabbing a bottle at random or going with what you're familiar with, you can start to narrow down your choices based on the flavors you know you enjoy.
It's like having a treasure map, and those tasting terms are the clues that lead you to the X that marks the spot.
I love that analogy. So let's say you're someone who really enjoys those big, bold, peaty whiskeys. You're not afraid of a little smoke. You might even enjoy that medicinal quality that some peated whiskeys have.
Right.
So, armed with your newfound knowledge, you might seek out a whiskey from Islay, knowing that region is famous for its peated whiskeys.
Exactly. Or let's say you're in the mood for something a little lighter, a little more on the fruity side of the spectrum. You might look for Speyside whiskey or something finished in a sherry cask.
Because you know those are more likely to have those characteristics.
Exactly. It's about using those tasting terms as guideposts to help you navigate the world of whiskey and discover new favorites along the way.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for whiskey.
I like that. I'm going to steal that.
Steal away. Okay, so you've used your newfound knowledge to choose your bottle. Now what?
Now comes the fun part, the tasting.
The main event.
Exactly.
Yep.
And here's where those tasting terms really come into play. Because now, instead of just sipping your whiskey and thinking, oh, this is nice, you can start to break down those flavors, identify the different elements at play.
And maybe even impress your friends with your sophisticated palate.
Huh? There's that too. But seriously, even if you're not trying to impress anyone, taking the time to really analyze the flavors and aromas of a whiskey can dramatically enhance your enjoyment of it.
Totally. It's like the difference between watching a movie with the sound off versus really paying attention to the dialogue, the music, the sound effects.
It's about engaging all of your senses.
Right. So next time you sit down with a dram of whiskey, don't just gulp it down. Take your time, swirl it around in your glass, stick your nose in there and take a good sniff.
Oh.
What do you smell? Do you get those floral notes? Is there a hint of spicy rye in the background?
And then take a sip. But don't swallow right away. Let it sit on your tongue for a moment. How does it feel in your mouth? Is it rich and oily or light and floral? Do you get those drying tannic sensations?
Pay attention to how the flavors change as you swallow. Do those oaky notes linger on your palate? Or maybe there's a hint of nutty sweetness on the finish.
The more you do this, the more attuned you'll become to the nuances of different whiskeys. You'll start to develop your own preferences, your own vocabulary for describing what you like and don't like.
And that's what's so cool about whiskey. There's no right or wrong answer.
It's all subjective. What tastes amazing to one person might not do anything for someone else, and that's okay.
It's about the journey, the exploration, and the joy of discovering new flavors and aromas.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that. And there you have it, folks. Another deep dive in the books. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the fascinating world of whiskey tasting terms with us.
Until next time, happy tasting.